And I have just started.
Awesome. All right. So I expect that people will continue to pile in over the next few minutes, but we'll get started. This is a little different because we had twice as many people RSVP'd for this than we've ever had on an assembly call before. So we are not using the nice little Hangout feature. Instead, we're on Neil's GoToMeeting. Thank you for that, Neil. But that also means that I'm going to have to some extent, manually set to have people on video chat. So if you start talking, I will try to remember to try to send you a request to join us by video, but we also welcome folks who are just by audio. And one more reminder, we have the notes document in the chat bar. You should be able to see a link. If you don't, send me a note, raise your hand, and we will try to get you in the document and caught up to speed. So with that said, we'll kick off. My name is Greg. I actually haven't met all of you, so I'm glad to be face-to-face with some of y'all. And I'm gonna have us do a very brief round of introductions, who you are, who you're representing, what community or organization you're representing, very briefly, and we'll hopefully have a chance at the end of the call to take some time to hear more about people's projects if they want to talk about them. But right now we'll just keep it brief. So I'm just going to hand it to Kin, and then I'll just go down the list that I see here in the GoToMeeting after Kin. I'll just call y'all out as I go. But Kin, start us off, and then we'll loop back to you for a more in-depth introduction afterwards.
Okay, my name is Kin Lane. I'm API evangelist. I am Greg's technical left hand. You're the right hand because I'm the technical, which is always left. And I'm overseeing the API definition and all things APIs.
Awesome. And Neil, our host for this video call.
Welcome to my virtual home. I'm Neil McKechnie, CTO for Charity Logic, which is the offer of iCarol, which is a major INR platform in North America and elsewhere.
Great. Benj?
Hi, this is Benj Kam from Health Leads. I'm the Director of Product Management for Health Leads Reach, which is our online resource database solution as part of a solution for healthcare. And we're really deeply invested in a vision of building the tools that will enable all of our organizations to collaborate more effectively on managing resources and better supporting our clients and customers. So that's what we're here to talk about.
Awesome. Let's see here. Chris Wisdo.
Hi, this is Chris. I am starting a project where we're hoping to use community service information to empower schools to do wraparound learning and integrated student support. We don't have funding for the project yet, but we're just trying to figure it out, and so I thought I would join the call.
Awesome. Dave Erlinson, our note-taker, our voluntold note-taker for the day.
Yeah, I am Dave Erlinson. I'm with 211 up in Minnesota. I'm also on the AIRS board, so just trying to lend any expertise from in the trenches where I can, and taking notes as well.
Thank you, Dave. David Santucci.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm David Santucci. I work at Naritas with Chris Wisdo, my colleague who introduced himself a couple of minutes ago. We're, as he said, we're working on a project to have resources for local school districts to match up services with kids.
Awesome. Jim Harris.
Hello, I'm Jim Harris with the National Center for State Courts, the Technology Division out of Williamsburg, although I reside in Orlando. And I'm also working very closely with a number of technical committees of the OASIS International Standards Organization, including a new one for big importers, which is very interested in the referral initiative.
All right. Jim, your audio was a little hard to hear, but I'll just relay to the group. Jim is with the National Center for State Courts, who are doing some really interesting things with data standards for legal resources and legal representation. Let's see, Joni Dotson.
Hi, I'm with Asimio, a local tech firm here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We work in the nonprofit area, and I'm relatively new, so I'm going to be mostly learning a lot today.
Great. Kate Lambecker.
Hello, sorry I was muted. Kate or Catherine Lambecker, and I work as a software developer on an open source community resource database project called OpenSeoc. And we have been doing data exchange between systems for more than a decade now, so this is a major area of interest for us.
Great. Linda Ross. All right, we're not hearing from Linda just yet, but we might loop back if we get our audio or our video. Matt, I don't see a last name. Is that Matt Pierce?
Yeah, Matt Peace with RTM Designs, along with Linda Ross with RTM Designs, the vendors for ReferNet, and
great. Awesome. Matt Gee.
Hi, everyone. I'm from the Center for Data Science and Public Policy at the University of Chicago and the Impact Lab. We do a lot of national work on data interoperability and kind of the missing data services layer and administrative data, including a big project in adult education with DOL for all training providers, homelessness services and criminal justice with HUD as part of the Data Driven Justice Initiative, and Thrive together in K-12. So it's really, really relevant, this convening, and we're really excited to sync up.
Awesome. Max Whitney.
Hi, I'm Max Whitney. I'm the Vice President of Engineering at Noom, but I met Greg well over a year ago now, and I finally have some volunteer cycles available, so I'm listening in what I can do to help.
Welcome, Max. Meg?
Hi, I'm Meg Finley. I am from the United Way in Philadelphia. I also work with the 211 in southeastern Pennsylvania. We have several different organizations and collaboratives interested in using 211's data, so I'm just here to try to understand the technical side of things a little bit more, so I'm more able to talk about those things with the folks who are interested in using our data.
Great. Shelby.
Hey, this is Shelby Switzer. I'm a software developer and integrations lead at Healthify. We provide databases, social services, and referral tracking, and I'm trying to integrate with other systems.
Awesome. Tim, we're going to hear from Tim in a bit, but Tim, go ahead, quickly introduce yourself.
Not hearing him.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Tim.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Greg, this is Donnie House in Tulsa.
Hi, Donnie.
I typed my name in on the agenda, so I didn't know if I was doing this right or not.
Great stuff. I don't see you on the list, but I'm glad to hear your voice. I don't see you on our attendees list, which is interesting.
It may be because my name is under another employee when I signed on.
Okay. Welcome, Donnie.
Okay. Donnie House in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We have a couple of projects in the beginning stages. One of them is a civil legal triage portal, and we're also working with RTM to translate our data into open referral standards. And then we were just notified on Friday that we're one of the recipients of the Accountable Healthy Communities grant.
Congratulations. Well done, Oklahoma.
Thank you.
I'm eager to talk with you all about that. So let's briefly hear from Unmesh, and then Tim, if you're having some trouble, just send me a note and let's troubleshoot on a back channel. Unmesh.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Unmesh Sheth. I'm a founder of SOPACT, a mission-driven organization to manage social impact cloud-based software. Our Beneficiary 360 product is collaborative system to integrate the case management of the external agencies, referral management systems, and they provide the poverty and process visualization, and finally integrates longitudinal and survey data management systems.
Awesome. All right, thanks so much. We have one more person to hear from, Tim Davies at the Open Data Services Co-op, but before we hear from him, because he's actually got the first piece of our agenda, which is very exciting, I'll just do a review of the agenda. It's great to have so many folks on the call. We took a little extra time for introductions. I've actually set this call to go 90 minutes since last time we went substantially over 60 minutes. But we know that that's long for some folks. So if you have to jump off towards, in the back third, that's okay. But we are going to hear from Tim Davies in the Open Data Services Co-op about the newly staged version 1.1 of the Human Services Data Specification. Our last call was about their proposed upgrades to that, and now we're going to review the new version, which is very exciting. It's the first formal update that we've made in 2 years to the spec. And then we'll hear a little bit about that. We'll have a little bit of time to ask a couple of questions, but mostly we'll just be identifying any issues that that are lingering or any questions that are lingering. We want to hand off from Tim to Kin, and I will talk about the next chapter in this development, where we'll be developing an OpenAPI specification. Kin will give a little bit of a technical, I'll discuss the procedural dimension. We'll talk about how we're doing this, and then Kin will talk about what we're doing specifically. I want to create some time for us to actually have a discussion about the different types of users that we are designing an API specification for, which is a nuanced question, I think. And we got into it a little bit last time, so we'll take some time to get even deeper into it this time. We have some volunteers on the call and also off the call who've offered to contribute cycles of their time over the next couple of months. And we have some ideas for how we can put them to best use, but I want to actually talk through that with you all and open the door for anybody who might actually want to take on a volunteer developer and build implementation of this API specification that actually works for you. And then I'll have a little bit of a conversation about a key component of our process, which is how we will be rooting it in dialogue with specific subject matter experts, AKA the people who actually collect information about community resources and use it to refer people to services. And then we'll end with some time to talk about next steps. All right, any questions or suggested revisions or additions to the agenda? All right, Tim, are we ready to hear from you?
Yes, is my audio working this time?
I see your face.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Ah, fantastic. Well, good to join you all. My name is Tim Davies from Open Data Services based in the UK. We've been supporting some of the work on updating the Human Services Data specification, and as some of you have contributed to that previously, we've now got a staged 1.1 version. So essentially at docs.openreferral.org, there is now a 1.1 version. I'm going to put the link in the chat for people to access. Hopefully you will see relatively few changes. It's mainly been about tidying up areas of the technical specification that needed clarification, but there is a changelog there that'll just highlight some of the main things we've worked on and clarified, and some of the things that are going forward into both the API work and future iterations. So firstly, HSDS previously had two possible models for linking the core entities it's got there of organizations, services, and locations where services are delivered. And that was creating some confusion. We had a way of a direct link and a service at location table. We've clarified that now so that you have an organization delivers services, organizations also are responsible for locations, and those services are linked then to locations. What you'll find in the logical model pages of the documentation is a summary then of all the different pieces of information that can be expressed about organizations, services, locations, or that can be overridden for a particular service at a location. So for example, everything, an organization, a service, a location can have a phone number, but you may say this service at this particular location has a different phone number, and you'd override that and link that. So at the technical level, we've clarified that model based on some of the discussions we had in our previous calls. And then we've also, in the reference pages of that documentation, tidied up some of the properties that have been discussed in earlier stages of HSDS development, but have been left out, particularly around the things like licenses or accreditations of services. For those who've been more engaged in this process, the one issue we did not in the 1.1 make substantial progress on was standardizing service area coverage. So we had some big discussions both on GitHub issues and in our last calls around how to represent the complexity of different administrative geographies, and the fact that a service is available to people who maybe live in a particular postcode or live in a one side of a postcode or one side of a street that runs down the middle of a boundary, and how do we capture and model that in a way that works in the US, in Canada, in the UK, across different borders. And I think we recognise there wasn't a clear consensus on the best way to do that. So that's something that's a challenge we've still got to meet for making data interoperable in the future versions. But what I'll be doing is asking for any other kind of minor feedback on this 1.1, but this will soon be flagged on the standard site as the latest version. Greg, if you just go down to where it says 1.1 dev at the little green at the bottom of the read the docs page, you'll see there that you'll still have access to the 1.0 documentation and the earlier version. So right now 1.0 is still the live version, but after this call I'll be setting 1.1 to be the current kind of canonical version of the standard, and that's what we'll then hopefully be building upon in the API work. For those relatively new to HSDS, this all gives you a model for publishing referral data as a collection of spreadsheets, as a collection of kind of CSV files or spreadsheets exported from your existing systems and then documented with a data package file. We recognize, and this is where we then go into the next phase of work, that actually that starts getting quite confusing because you end up with a complicated relational model. And what the API work should move us towards is some ways to express that in very standard structured ways as well. So hopefully this has been a clearing the groundwork exercise more than anything else, but to get us towards hopefully now fully consistent data package JSON file to define this, and at least to address some, although I would admit not all, of the areas where we know more efforts needed on making things interoperable.
Thank you, Tim. Really briefly, and then I want to hear from folks if you have questions or comments. Just as a reiteration, HSDS was developed through a participatory research process. We had 4 different types of users, very broad types. And I've linked to the documentation of the user personas at the top of the notes document. If you see, let's see, it's under the user stories and personas under the first link. And I will also post it into the chat bot. We observed that all the different types of users seem to fall into 4 different categories. Or at least the types of stakeholders for Open Referral seem to fall into 4 categories. There's people seeking help, there's people providing help, providing services of some kind, or providing referrals to services. There's researchers and analysts who are trying to understand macro patterns and see the allocation of resources in a community. And then there's database administrators who are actually working with this data. And I think it's fair to say that the primary user for HSDS as a specification are database administrators. And the reason I bring this up is that one of the first orders of business for the next chapter when we're developing an OpenAPI specification is to dig in, I think primarily to that category, although we might double check our assumptions there, but we want to identify in our next iteration, who are the different types of users of an API? because there are going to be different use cases associated with each one of those, and we want to be able to articulate them so that we can evaluate our progress, see if we're meeting their needs through this development. So that's just some backstory and also some foreshadowing. And now I'll step back, see if anybody has questions for Tim or questions about the spec or this process in general. And if you raise your hand, I will try to throw you the video if that's possible.
Tim, feel free to kick this over to the GitHub issue list, but two things. One, are we considering a validation tool where people can submit a set of files, and the validation tool will tell you if you're compliant with the spec or not? And then somewhat relatedly, and as a segue to the API conversation, are we considering a JSON version of the spec?
So I think I'm going to ping both of those into the API conversation and GitHub issues. Yeah, validator is something we know would be really useful. We have tried to find a data package validator that could do that and not found something that fully meets the needs there. I know Greg's also been working to see if we can get validators built, but we should now have the data package JSON file such that it's easier to build out a validator.
And so from an API perspective, there'll definitely be a JSON schema validator. This is primarily to validate it in relationship to the request or the response model of the APIs. And we'll have a JSON and a YAML version of the schema, as well as the API interface, which I'll talk about during the API segment shortly.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll put it on GitHub and we can get into more depth on both those topics so we don't bog down this call.
I think there is a validator issue in the GitHub queue, although it might have been at one point closed because we had an earlier version. So let's check for that and bring it back because it's absolutely a very important next step, I think. Thank you.
Have you guys already looked at the data packages tool as a reference data validator?
Yeah, I reached out on the frictionlessdata.io discussion board to look for anything they have that has both the code generators and validators. And what I heard initially was there weren't either yet, but if there are some, please do definitely share.
Yeah, in fact, we're in dialogue with the Open Knowledge folks who developed the frictionless data specification and tools, and this might be an opportunity to sort of go back to them and ask for more guidance, although it sounds like this already came up in our queue and they said what we were describing doesn't yet, or actually that might have been for a data package generator. We'll follow up on this. Any other questions about version 1.1? I think there's one issue in particular that Tim pointed to where we went back and forth on it on the last call. It's clearly a complex topic. That's the service area issue. And it seems like right now we've heard different valid perspectives on how to structure that. Neil, I know that you had some good points about it. Tim, I don't know if we want to briefly touch on that specifically and how we should address this issue moving forward if it's not something that we're resolving in 1.1. And we can recap the issue. I don't know, Tim, are you able to recap that particular issue and what we discussed last time?
I can try, yes. So I think at the moment we have the concept in the schema of a service area, which says what area does this service cover? It's a one-to-many relationship. So you can say that you can have a number of entries in the service area table pointing to a service. And so that would be saying this covers New York or this particular district or this particular postcode area. What Neil had suggested, which I think has a lot of grounds to it, was coming up with a kind of common hierarchy for that, so that you'd maybe always express with the state name first, or country, state, region, and so on. The challenge we found is that doesn't work for all countries and contexts. So, for example, Catherine was highlighting the way in which a postcode in Canada could cover multiple states, and yet a service is only delivered for the portion of that postcode that falls within another state. So in the GitHub issue that's associated there, that I'll put a link to in the chat shortly, we have managed, I think, to separate out that there's two issues going on there that are important for referrals. One is you want to disambiguate locations, to say that Stroud UK is different from Stroud US, or the same place name is a different place name, and disambiguation is relatively easy for us to handle, because geocoders and other things can, with enough information, disambiguate. The trickier one, I think, is containment, where you say, I want the intersection of these different locations. I want the piece of this postcode or the piece of this district that also intersects with that administrative area because of who's eligible to access the service. That's the one which requires much more knowledge of the geography of the place you're naming. I think there are a couple of different ways to deal with this challenge, but it needs kind of use cases from attempts to share data between different systems. One way is that people who are planning to share data with each other simply agree in advance how they're going to structure their data in that field outside of the standard taking an opinion. The other is that we come up with an opinionated way in the standard of representing that geography that's particularly important when we're trying to share across cultural boundaries or country boundaries. So what we have done in the updated version of the schema is introduce a on-service area. It was simply the ID of the service and a text field. We now have the ID of the service, a text field, and a description field, so that the caveats in human readable sense for location can be put in there. So where, for example, it is things that referral systems may hold around, people living on this side of that intersection are eligible and those on the other side aren't, even if the kind of town name is more general. So the town name is disambiguated. The containment question is only human structured, not machine readable structured. So we've kind of got that as an interim, but coming up with that wider solution definitely needs more brains and thoughts in that conversation, and particularly people who are trying to exchange data to share both thoughts and use cases, because I think there's probably a range of different user needs, from the referral need, the research need, and so on around that.
So if I can recap what I heard, Tim, this is a tricky issue. We have some ways of coping with it. Those ways are probably not in the long term necessarily satisfactory in terms of establishing interoperability at scale, but our options are either to take an opinion in the spec or to have that responsibility fall with the people who are trying to exchange data. And at this point, we're choosing the latter so that we can get more examples and use cases and data that might inform a future opinion that we might take in, for example, 2.0. Is that correct? Yeah, I'm seeing yes.
Hi, sorry, Greg, it's
yes.
Catherine, can I just interrupt for 1 second?
I was going to kick it to you after this.
Yeah. I wanted to point out that I really liked the way that Tim distinguished between providing clarity in the region and there is really a difference between cumulative things and disambiguation of the region, and dividing those as two different issues, to me, is the key to exchanging information that works. Because if you have one person who interprets a list of data, say that includes both a county and a neighborhood, and adds them together, versus another person who subtracts them or uses them for clarity, the search results are very different. And so identifying that these are two separate paths that both need to be addressed, to me, is the most important part of the problem. So yay, thank you. That's a great clarification.
All right. Good work, Tim. Any other questions about version 1.1? Tim and his group have been working on this for almost a year now, so I really applaud the work that they've done. I'm super excited to have an upgraded version of this spec, and I want to make sure we hear any questions or procedurally or technically before we jump off to the next chapter? All right. So we're going to talk about what comes next. And also I'm going to give Tim the green light to push 1.1 officially. Hooray. That was easy.
Exciting.
Awesome. Okay. So we're going to talk about the OpenAPI Specification project, which is the main agenda item. First, some context. This is a project that is funded by what was Markets for Good and is now known as Digital Impact, which is a part of the Stanford Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society. It's funded in part by the Gates Foundation. And this is sort of a trial run. I'm glad that we got this funding because there's very few sources of funding for such technical infrastructure kinds of things. We, of course, asked for a lot less than what it would normally cost out on the market. So a lot of the people who are going to be participating, there's going to be a mix of some paid work and a lot of volunteered work. And I'm happy to talk more about those details. But first, I want to walk you through what we have is we have the first draft, and you'll see my notes are still in here, of a project charter. This is linked in the notes document, and I'm also sharing it here. We'll walk through it. Oops, I just shared it to, how do I do, okay. I'm sharing it in the chat bot now. So this walks us through the basics in terms of what we're trying to accomplish with this project and how we're going to do it. Y'all should be familiar with the big vision. We're trying to build a future in which up-to-date information about health and human services is sustainably, reliably accessible to anyone who might need it in any kind of institutional, geographical, or technical context using any channel that works for them. So that's the big vision. The specific objective of this particular project is to establish a common set of protocols for modeling APIs, regardless of what technology or programming language you're using. And we'll develop some open source tooling that facilitates the development and use of this API. So to step back a little bit, when we developed HSDS, we already had Ohana, which was a Code for America project from 2013 as the reference implementation. And in the meantime, people have developed other APIs on their own systems, which is awesome, referencing HSDS. And now we're sort of taking the next level in this process to establish interoperability across those APIs so that they're all speaking a common language. Any questions about this high level so far? Just the basics, what we're trying to do. Okay, cool. So what you'll see in this charter is I have a little like sample version of a process map. We are describing the phases. We're currently kicking off with this call, phase 1. We'll be forming a sort of semi-formal working group. We'll be approving this charter. We'll be establishing our personas and setting up our channels in this first formation process and sort of reviewing what we discover in the field from our participants. In phase 2, Kin will be engaging in a select set of API implementers to learn about their schema, their implementation of HSDS, their use case, and he'll be sort of factoring that into a process of modeling a common API, OpenAPI specification, and we'll hear from Kin shortly. We'll run a series of tests over the course of the next 6 months, building reference implementations and getting your feedback. And then the final phase will come out with an OpenAPI spec that has been to some extent field tested and upgraded, and reference implementations, possibly even a new version of Ohana or multiple new versions of Ohana, and also proposals for the road ahead. So as you'll see, this is all an iterative process. Every chapter, we are really learning about what the next chapter should look like. And at the conclusion of this project, we will only be clearer on what we should do next in the future. So any questions about that so far? I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of procedural mechanics here in just a moment. All right. So this list of milestones is probably a little bit out of date, but the long view is we're still on target. We have the basic sort of partnership framework. I'm the project lead. Kin will be the technical lead. We are going to assemble a working group and also a group of stakeholders, user representatives. This process is open to anyone, but we are going to be weighting the feedback that we get from people who are actually implementing this spec in their APIs on a couple of, depending on a couple of criteria, and we'll be also reviewing choices that we have to make along the way with this group of stakeholders, and setting our priorities according to what we hear from them. And so very briefly right now, what we're proposing in terms of the criteria for sitting on this semi-formal working group is that you're implementing an API using our spec. You're willing to bring the documentation or the API itself to the table, both sharing it with Kin and also making it viewable to the rest of the folks in the group. That's a criteria for actually being able to participate as, and give weighted feedback. And also, the third criteria is that we're able to identify someone who wants to use your technology who we can actually talk to, like a user. And so anybody who doesn't meet any of those three criteria is still welcome to share feedback, to follow along, of course, but that'll be the boundaries of the working group. And I'm hoping that we have about 5. In fact, if we go over 5, we'll probably have to check our capacity to work with more than 5 groups. Because, like I said, we have a very limited budget to actually do this. But that's the overview for the stakeholder group. I do want to talk a little bit more about that later on the call, because I think that's one of the big questions that has yet to be firmed up, is how we're going to be rooting this process in dialogue with our stakeholders. But I'll pause there and see once again if we have any questions. Cool, this is so easy so far. So here's what, before I kick it to Kin, I'm gonna share a little bit about what we're thinking, how this will work in terms of the cadence. And this is all subject to review. Right now, I want your feedback on this whole project charter. We will approve the charter, assuming all the feedback is positive, affirmative, constructive. We'll hopefully approve the charter in our, whenever we convene next. But in the meantime, basically what we're thinking is that we'll have a series of one-on-ones with Kin, the technical lead, and any API implementer who wants to join this working group. Kin will walk both through what we've done and also walk through, wherever you're at. And that'll be a sort of confidential conversation, but he'll both provide advisement to you as an implementer on how you're designing your API, and even potentially a little bit of API, business strategy. And he'll also gather insight from your schema, your existing API implementation, use it to go through the modeling process. And then we'll have regular, possibly monthly group check-ins, where we'll review any issues that come up that we have to get face-to-face to discuss. And Kin and I will also have like a weekly office hour period where we'll be hanging out in Slack, and you'll be able to just check in and chat with us. Still sound pretty good? Cool. We will be logging stuff in GitHub. We will have this Google Doc and also a Drive folder specifically for the project, and we have to decide like where the tasks will be managed, if not just the GitHub issues queue. We have Trello partisans, and also I saw a Waffle partisan, and we'll be figuring that out shortly. But suffice it to say, I welcome your feedback for what you think would make for a good project along these lines. Okay, that is the extent of the project charter. Again, just to reiterate, it bears repeating, welcoming your feedback on improving this charter, and we'll approve it as our next step moving forward. Cool. Ken, take it from here. I haven't heard any questions, so I think folks are eager to hear from you. So give us an introduction and talk us through, what you've done so far and where you see this going, and set any prompts for discussion or next steps.
Sounds
and I
good.
can also,
Can
can I give you the screen share? Is that possible? Let me see.
That's what I was going to ask.
All right, let's see. Make presenter. Yeah.
All right.
Did that work?
Yes, hold on. I'm trying to figure out which monitor it's going to show you here.
I see the project charter.
All right. Now do you see green, blue?
Yep.
Colorful screen. All right. Well, let me just kind of back up a little bit and kind of articulate where I'm coming at this API process from. So, I mean, one, this is what I do for a living full time is help understand how people design and deploy API interfaces so that I can give feedback and best practices to people who are doing it, as well as kind of be the lead like I am for Open Referral and HSDS. But my work is very much dependent on Tim's group's work, so I want to kind of articulate that they're very much in charge of the schema and how we store and represent this valuable information. My role is very much how we're accessing and sharing that information and making it usable in a variety of applications, not just websites, but and mobile apps, but system-to-system integrations. And one way that we do this in the space, this is part of me bringing best practices from the world of APIs into just the human services kind of layer. This is based upon how companies are doing it out there, from Twitter to Amazon to Google. But one of the ways that we describe APIs, this is probably pretty small, let me zoom out, is one of the formats that we use to describe it is called the OpenAPI specification, which is governed under the OpenAPI initiative, which is part of the Linux Foundation. That's a mouthful, but it's very much like what Greg just walked through as far as what we're trying to set up here is, but this is governing a specification that can be used to describe all API specifications. So, for example, I'm also working on open APIs for healthcare, the federal healthcare interoperability standard, the PSD2, which is a UK and EU banking. So an open API can be used to describe any API, and it's a JSON or a YAML way of expressing the surface area or the request and response model of an API, which a big part of that is Tim's group's work on the core schema for HSDS, which in this case, I'm using a JSON schema, which is part of the OpenAPI to describe it. So I'm gonna kind of wanted to give you a background on OpenAPI. If you need more help, understanding what OpenAPI's role is, it's much bigger than HSDS, but I'm happy to help you, walk through that. What I wanted to work on today was articulating from the HSDS API, and I'm very dependent on what already exists and very dependent on Tim's group's work. And so what I've done is created an OpenAPI specification for version 1.0 of the schema and the API that is derived from Ohana. So it's the one implementation we have right now. And like Tim's team was very much dependent on what came before them with the schema, I'm very dependent on what came before in regards to an API. And so on the left-hand side, I have some documentation that shows basically the API paths that are available from the Ohana implementation. And it allows pretty good coverage of locations some for organizations, and a basic search. So I believe, sorry, I'm gonna scroll down real quick here because I forget the number, but 30 paths basically were available in version 1. And then what I'm proposing in a version 1.1 is basically just creating a what's considered a CRUD representation. And CRUD is an acronym for create, read, update, and delete, which basically are the basic functions that you tend to do with databases. And what a good portion of APIs tend to emulate is basically just allowing people to get contacts, get locations, update those contacts, update those locations. And then what I've done with V1 is kind of represented the entire schema, which I'll now update and keep in sync with Tim's work. And my schema right now, represented as part of the API, is very much 1.0. I will take his work, update it so that the V1.1 of the API represents creating, updating, deleting the entire, and adding to the entire surface area of the schema, which if you scroll down is pretty lengthy. It allows granular level access to all the schedule, metadata, funding, basically every area of the schema. And like I said, I'll have to update this for the work that's been done. But it resulted basically in adding 130 paths to this. Not everyone's going to use this, but this allows for much more versatile and comprehensive work, deployment of APIs. But this just provides a kind of master list that people can consider when they consider deploying their API. It's not a requirement that every HSDS OpenAPI or API specification or deployment has to match this entirely. This is just the reference list. And so I'll be moving this through the Referral GitHub organization right now. Just so people don't get confused when you see adopt the agency in the URLs for any of my work. Adopt the agency is my Knight Foundation funded work. I got a grant to do open data work. And so Greg and I have kind of married that together with Open Referral. So just so you don't get confused, it'll usually start as an adopt the agency project. And as it becomes more formalized, I move it under the Open Referral work. But this link's available in the notes. And so you can get at, there's an Open API here, and it's a YAML version, although I have a JSON version behind the scenes as well. It takes a little bit to load. The YAML version for me tends to increase the reach of people who can read it because it doesn't have all the brackets and quotes and JSON that tends to confuse people. So basically, I won't walk through all of this, but an Open API allows me to describe the general API, what it does. This is the Open Referral kind of master. It could, the host to base path, it's just an example because this will be used to deploy many APIs in many different places, but really gives a machine readable description of the entire surface area of the API. And then what I've done is provided a documentation version of that where you can just kind of read it, see what each path provides, what the request parameters look like, basically how the request and the responses of each API path speaks to the schema and Tim's group's work on V1 2.1, and basically providing access to all of the schema if possible. So this is just my kind of draft proposal right now. Like I said, it's just based on evolving from V1.0 to V1.1. It's trying to make it comprehensive and represent access to the whole schema. I welcome discussion around this, and I'll be opening up this discussion forum that is basically a chat around each path. So basically, we can comment on each path as part of the Open API. Any comments that are left here end up showing on the GitHub issues for the project, for the GitHub repo. You have to be added as a member of that repo to be able to participate in this. But if you would like to be added, let me know and I'll add you. But basically, that's where we're at right now with this. Is we have the draft proposal for V11. What I'm doing now is going through and I want to open it up for well first actually I have to take Tim's work on 1.1 and make sure it's reflected in here 100%, and then open it up for everyone to comment and provide feedbacks. But that can happen simultaneously. And then I'm going through our first, what I consider vendor partner implementation, which is iCarol, and taking Neil's team's work. They've shared their specification with me. I'm taking it and I'm going to go through this and come up with the first kind of harmonization between a major vendor implementation and talk about, well, how do similar to how his teams provide feedback on the schema, what's needed from an API perspective. And as Greg said, our strategy, the charter kind of guides doing this over the next 6 months we're hoping up to 5 or more of these types of harmonization that need to occur with the API. Because in my experience, basically, sorry, I'm kind of clicking here, let me stay on one page, but basically the API itself will improve how you access this information, how you provide requests and responses to the APIs, how that's very dependent on feedback from the community. And I have a couple major decisions to make right now as far as how we return the responses from these APIs. It's not enough to just return the schema and make sure it's schema compliant. We need to think about other kind of evolutionary aspects, and not to get too technical, but there's a couple of other definitions that we should consider using, like JSON API or HAL, which are two ways of crafting or providing a kind of framework for thinking through how we provide responses. And it helps us address things like thinking through pagination, large data sets being returned, how we provide relationships between entities and other actions that you can take around the data. So I'll be kind of bringing those to the table, as well as talking about a common error strategy. How when the API responds successfully, what does that look like? When it responds not successfully, what does that look like? So we have a couple of these major decisions on the table to make, as well as providing, kicking off the kind of vendor feedback of this discussion. But it's not a blank canvas. It's a draft canvas now, basically for everyone to provide feedback on. So
awesome, thank you, Kim.
Yeah.
So that was a whole lot, and this is really, again, this is a kickoff. So we want to field your questions. Any issues that start to get into the weeds, we're going to note in the documentation and take offline. But go ahead and let us hear your questions, your comments, etc.
Kim, this is Neil. Very exciting to have this level of progress. And I think in the end of your comments, you kind of touched on my couple of questions, which were, what's your philosophy around returning related objects when you interrogate an object, like an organization or a location or service? There are child objects, there are peer objects. Maybe you haven't settled that yet, and we have to get into the weeds. And then the second one is thinking around how you interrogate the data when you don't know the IDs of the things you want returned. You just want to search, show me anything that matches this set of criteria, which I think also ought to be baked into the spec as well. So you may not have answers on either of those things right now, but certainly a couple of major areas for us to get into.
Yeah, I'll be adding GitHub issues for these discussions, but really we're at API design time right now, and to not get too much in the weeds, there's some pretty major architectural decisions, and I know there's one person on this call that has some strong opinions in these areas, but how we use hypermedia, API design patterns as far as allowing those relationships to occur in this kind of more evolutionary experience, how we're experiencing the data, not just requests and response updates and deletes, which are very machine oriented. I would say hypermedia API design patterns really allow for us to make it much more about how the data is actually going to be experienced and used and put to use. And then we could also have discussions around GraphQL, which is another kind of emerging design pattern that can allow much more database and data focus. So you can actually structure, when you make a request of the API, you say, I want these fields returned. I don't want that whole thing, or I want these collections and these, the relationships of phone numbers. I don't care about schedule, and lets you kind of craft the response that you wish as a developer. But it introduces a much more complex API design, so I want to be thoughtful of that. So these are all conversations we'll be having over the next couple weeks via GitHub on this. But these things can also coexist to some degree, meaning the API, there can be a very simple 101 representation of the API meant to reach a very large and wide audience. We can also allow the negotiation through the API of a more advanced, if you're an advanced user and you have more advanced system integrations that you need to accomplish. So these things can coexist, but we'll be having these discussions for sure. Oh, awesome. one other thing I wanted to add in there that you mentioned was discovery. So describing this in using OpenAPI is kind of a base step to discovery, and how you allow people to discover and understand and play with, meaning the OpenAPI can be loaded in a tool that's called Postman, which is very much a developer tool for playing with APIs and understanding what request and response look like, and helping you fully kind of understand what an API is capable of. I meant to show this in the screen as well. This API definition, this spec right here is the overall kind of draft spec. I have an actual, where is it? Somewhere in here. I have an actual implementation of this spec, meaning a functional version. This is how I can't just craft and design the spec. I have to have it functional for it to work in my head. And this is we have an actual developer portal that isn't just recommendations for the API, it's recommendations for the entire API operations around it. So this spec will go beyond just the API itself, but I actually have a functioning version of this, and this has a discovery mechanism built into it. The entire API is available via an API's JSON file, which allows, it works like hypermedia, but differently, allows you to discover all the endpoints, as well as the OpenAPI that describes the entire API. So it goes much further. If you want help understanding that side of it, it's a lot more to chew on as well. But I can help anyone that wants more education, learn more. So let me know.
Ken, let's make sure that I get that link in our notes, and I'll put it at the top of the line when we're sending these notes back to the group.
Sounds good.
Questions. I want to actually open up a topic for discussion branching from this, but any questions, any more questions for Ken?
Hi, Chris Wisdo here. One quick question. Is integration across systems part of the use case for the API? So version control and figuring out which entities that might be coming from two different source agencies might be the same, deduping, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's an area that I want to come out of kind of this next layer of this discussion around the design patterns that we're going to be adopting. So if we go with JSON API as our kind of envelope of how organizations, locations, every API path returns information, we'll be making other design time kind of decisions around how we're going to version this, how you version your API, how you handle parameters, how you handle headers, so all of that lives in the OpenAPI definition. It's how we describe that's there, but also that definition for how we design APIs and provide design guidance exists within that documentation, and I'll produce a guide to go along with that. That's basically, hey, if you're launching an open API or an HSDS API using our open API design standards, here's a guide to go with it. Here's how you think about naming your endpoints. You should name them like this because, you know, calling it /organization is universal. It's in the standard. That's how you'll be compliant. But also down to the granular. Here's a suggested list of how you handle your status codes and error codes. So I'll have a full design guide to go with that as far as implementations are concerned.
I want to potentially jump off Chris's question to talk about different types of users and therefore different use cases that sort of fall within our purview. Any last questions for Kin before I jump off to that?
Kin, are you going to include in the specification authentication approaches, or is that left to the implementation people?
Well, no, that'll be in there, and that can be identified via the OpenAPI. It allows for describing key-based JSON web tokens as well as OAuth. We're just going to be, you know, I'm emulating what's in the current Ohana right now, which is basically basic auth, putting keys in the header, and well, okay, so it's a hybrid of basic auth and key based because it issues a key. But Ohana doesn't really have a kind of scalable approach to that as far as how you handle many keys and how you handle logging, you know, so aka modern kind of API management stuff. So yeah, I'll just have a security definition reference in there that to what exists right now, but then I'll build a kind of plan for how we evolve the key-based as well as guidance on eventually some sort of OAuth or JSON web token approach for more sophisticated implementations.
Great, thank you.
Or SAML, single sign-on, stuff like that.
I also I want to read here what I'm seeing from Shelby Switzer in the chat box. Shelby says, I'm glad to, Shelby, are you there? You want to chime in? Well, she says in the chat box, I'm glad to hear hypermedia formats are on the table, so important for interoperability and discoverability as well as other benefits. And she says that Healthify is using HOW for our external API.
So yes. She's who I was talking about.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We got you.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I just, reiterating what I've said in the chat, it's really exciting to see that's still on the table and that there's still so much room for discussing the structure and the format of the API and room for learning. I'm really interested to hear about, the reasons and the kind of development of the Ohana API and the decisions for how it is and kind of learnings that we've had since that first development.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I want to have Shelby, I'll ping you and we'll set up a separate call to have around just this kind of diving into the hypermedia discussion, and anybody else who kind of wants to participate in that or is just curious, hypermedia curious, I welcome you to join, but we'll definitely hash through all of this.
Okay. Unless there's something else pressing, we'll still have some time to talk. I want to set aside 10 minutes or so to talk about the different kinds of personas in this layer of our domain, by which I mean, who are we actually designing an API specification for? Who are the different types of users who might use an API, right? Not just the apps that use an API, or the technologies that are using an API. And so last time we sort of went around and I took some notes and I crunched up a first draft framework that I want us to sort of tear down and build up again. And I'm going to call upon Catherine Lambacker, who had some great feedback, and see if I've captured something that's reasonable. What I heard, the range of possible user types include a researcher who's trying to pull, like, for example, large sets of this data for research and analysis purposes, application programmer who's designing a tool that will use the API. We also heard a database administrator who's actually working with the content potentially among several different systems. And for example, Catherine mentioned the need for a sanity check feature. And I'd love to hear some more examples of that. I also have here, and I'm not actually sure that this is a user type, but I wanted to throw it out there and see what people thought. It's the kind of thing that we're designing for in our Florida Legal Services project, and that is the organization that provides services that's reporting its own information about services. And I'm not sure if we consider them an API user or if we're imagining that there will be forms that use an API that they're filling out. But these are the different types at a high level that I've heard so far, and I want to see if we're missing anything, and also see if we can build on specific user stories within them that help us focus on the use cases for which these APIs are going to be valuable. Does that all make sense? And I want to open the floor for folks to share, you can speak from experience, does your use case not fall within any of those buckets that I just described? And let's see what we get.
Do you want me to jump in first, Greg, since you mentioned me?
Yes. And
Okay.
I'm taking notes in the minutes document. I'm just gonna show my screen on that if that's all right. Ken, I'll take it off of you.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask.
All right. Go for it.
So I'll go over the main, we get a really predictable pattern of requests for data. It surprisingly hasn't varied over, I don't know, 14, 15 years. It's always the same set of requests. I've yet to see anything novel, which is kind of interesting. So the number one thing obviously is exchange between systems. So people want to maintain less data by leveraging the work of another system and combine. It's usually combining, so there's certain features of the way that happens that I think are important when you think about it. When people are doing the exchange, they're usually mixing it with other data. So in most cases, they're not taking the data and just using it as it is. They're trying to combine it with other data that they have. That's not always the case, but the majority of the case it is. In my experience. The other thing that is a common feature of exchange between systems is the addition of data. So usually they're trying to take someone else's information and add another layer of content onto that data. So extra classifications or other type of information that's custom to them, which is why they don't want to directly use the data in the system. So that's to distinguish from another use case, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is someone who literally just wants to be able to search and display the data according to some, branding or something specific they want, but they don't want to change the data. So right now I'm talking about actually transporting data between systems, and generally the intent in that case is combination with data from other systems and or layering additional information on top of the data such that the data in the source system is not adequate by itself to meet the need. Okay, so that's the big one that I have worked with most extensively. I need to get my data shipped to another system. I can't use it in the source system because I have to combine it with other information or add additional data to it. So the source data isn't adequate on its own. Use case number two is basically, I would call it a branding issue where people don't actually want to manipulate the data. They might want to be selective about the data that they display, so display a portion of the source data and not all of it, but their primary driver appears to be branding the information in a different way, presenting it as their own, if you will, without having to maintain the data themselves. So they really want a way to just change how the end user is interacting with the same information. So a direct API that doesn't store the data anywhere is very useful in that situation because all you care about is changing the way the user sees the information and what it looks like and who it looks like it belongs to. But you're not actually making alterations to the source data in any way under that use case. A third one that I see pretty often is what I would call a one-time dump. So this is people, it can be research type activity. It's often for analyzing the current state or running a report versus an ongoing use, even though they might do it regularly once a year or once every 6 months or something. And in those cases, they tend to want to reduce the complexity of the information they're receiving because they have something very specific in mind. They only want it for that use case. They're not interested in reproducibility or building anything on top of it. They want, and those are the people who usually ask for, can I get it all in one spreadsheet? They want the data for a particular project or kind of a one-off, and they want it to be simple without them having to make any technical investment because it tends to be short-term. So those are the main three that we tend to get. I have more recently been getting open-ended requests for, we want to make our data available generically. We don't know who our end user is, but we want to be able to present it in a format that's accessible for an unknown market. And that's the open data type of request where, they feel like someone out there wants their data. They don't exactly know what they're going to do with it, but they want to make it as accessible as possible. So they're looking for basically a low technical overhead way of doing ongoing exports with no specific consumer in mind. And that's a more recent request from what we've always gotten, which is the other three that I mentioned.
That is super helpful context, Catherine. Thank you. And so I've put those notes.
I just want to say,
go ahead.
I always love hearing your perspective, Catherine. You really nail it and have a breadth of understanding. Thank you.
Kate, I want to echo that, Kate. That was a super description. I think it opens a lot of doors into things we need to explore with the API, like change tracking and revision history, or show me the last 3 updates to this record kind of stuff, which we can get into offline. But I just want to applaud as well. Great summary.
Thank you.
I'll join the party. This is Benj, and say your kind of classification, I see like a further version of your first, which was combining data, and I'd call that data federation or data collaboration, where there's a group of folks who want to collaborate on maintaining a data set while not necessarily having a single repository where the data lives. So a way with HSDS, I think of that model as we can all publish our data in a consistent way and someone can crawl and compile it. But this is a model where we're more actively in real time sharing updates, posting updates, and having shared standards around what makes it into the shared federated version.
Beautiful, because when you do a query, you don't want 15 different versions of the American Red Cross. You want one definitive one, and that's going to depend on which data sets you're combining. So that's a super catch as well, Benj.
Totally, and it's going to raise issues like, Neil, you and I might each have a database and we're collaborating, a shared database. You have your IDs in my system, I have my IDs in my system. There may even be a shared federated ID, so we're working with multiple unique identifiers that need to be managed in some consistent, logical way.
Yeah, we're going to end up coming up with a whole kind of supporting structure in the API beyond the data schema itself for this kind of data management, all these data management scenarios, which are very real and very necessary. That's great.
So this is all super helpful, and I also happen to know from a previous conversation with Catherine that she has a whole system for unique identifier management, which is awesome, and I think we'd have a lot to learn from her there as well. But before we go into those weeds, I do want to make the point that what we have here is a set of use cases, which I think is a really good starting point. I want us to make sure that we're working backwards from that to think about, again, the different types of users, because I think there are use cases that might apply across different types of users, but having both of those lenses, I think, is really important, right? What I've heard are, again, issues of people who are managing data across different systems. I've heard people who are building delivery mechanisms, right? A web page or an application or so on. Those are different use cases. And I think having clarity on the different types while we build our user stories of like, I want to be able to do this is going to be really important. We have examples of this from our work developing HSDS and Ohana, and I can share our user story spreadsheet. Let me dig that up. And once we have our user types, we'll be building these user stories under them. And sometimes there might be matching, but I want to see if I'm missing anything, right? I have researcher, someone who wants to pull, all the data or a particular subset of the data for analysis. I have application programmer, someone who's building some delivery mechanism for the data. I have database administrator or manager who's actually editing, working with the data. Are there other types of users that folks on the call think aren't covered within those?
This may fall into one of those categories. This is Meg Finley from Philadelphia, but I know I have gotten requests specifically from some health systems in the area who would like to make more direct connections for patients who are in need of, like, for example, food assistance to providers directly. And so I'm not sure if that would be something that this could assist with, but I just wanted to throw that out there as, like, instead of just an information or referral kind of system that 211 is doing, to use our data to be able to contact those referral services that we have in our database more directly, like send them an email with the person's information after they have permission to do so, or I think it could happen a number of different ways, but that's been one thing that's been brought up a number of times from different folks.
Greg, as we evolve these personas and these buckets, I think we might want to make sure and have a kind of industry dimension to it. If it's education, if it's healthcare, because those variations on those personas may shift a little bit. Or is that too grand?
I think that's a good question, and it's something that we can play out specifically in the legal services space, right? Because we have open referral projects across the legal services sector, and we do expect to hear from them that they have a set of additional fields that are specific to the legal services sector that they're going to propose as an extension. I think for the purposes of this particular project, that's outside of our scope. Although we might learn information that we fold into recommendations for future development. But right now we're keeping things at a common core. And Meg, I think also some of the functionality that you're referring to there, which I find really exciting. Thank you for that feedback. Some of the functionality I suspect is kind of next generation stuff, but the suggestion in the first place does seem to affirm my sense that an organization that provides services that is listed in the database is itself potentially a user of these APIs that we should start designing for. So assuming that is correct, that's our fourth user type that we've identified so far is I'm an organization, my services are listed in this database, and I should be able to interact with the API. I think that's an assumption that we should test, whether that's actually a use case or whether that's a use case for an interface for editing data that could be one of many interfaces. So I'm curious to hear folks' thoughts on that specifically, and or any other types of users that we haven't sketched out so far.
So this is Catherine again. You've reminded me actually that we have some other newer use cases. I didn't think about them because they're actually for a side thing where we have this WordPress plugin, which we built an API for the plugin, but it's specifically designed to allow the organizations to list their own services on their website. So one of them is. So that's a case where the organization themselves can go in and post. We have volunteer opportunities and other things tied to ours, so it might be a more specific use case that doesn't apply to everyone, but we have actual practical cases of people listing their own postings and using the API for themselves. So that is a real world application that we are supporting right now.
Awesome. All right. So Yeah, go ahead. Who's that?
Hopefully, it's Jim. Hopefully you're hearing me better this time.
Yep, I see you and I hear you.
Good. You know, the organizations providing services, I mean, one could argue that in reality, there are users who belong to that organization that fall into one of the other three categories. So I don't know how granular we're getting here, but.
That's a good observation, and we actually made that same observation at the HSDS level when we're describing help seekers, help providers, database administrators, and researchers. Those different types of users are not exclusive. There can be overlap between any of those in any particular use case. Still, I think it's valuable to be able to delineate between the different kinds of roles that someone might play, right? I might be acting at an organization as a service provider. I might be acting as a representative of this organization, reporting the details about my services. I might be acting at the organization as someone who's editing information about other organizations, right? Having those different roles and being able to understand what someone needs when they're inhabiting any one of those different roles, I think is going to be clarifying for us as we do this work. And what I've heard so far is affirmation that we at least have a solid first baseline for our understanding of what does this universe look like with 4 different user types listed here. Okay. There are a couple other things I want to talk about before we peace out, but go ahead. Who's that?
This is Benj. I was going to say, like, looking at this list of user types, I think like the people seeking help category from the HSDS belongs here also, and like perhaps those folks are primarily proxied through application programmers who are building applications for them to use it, but like by that logic, all of these could be hidden under application programmer, and I think it's worth calling that out. Like all of those personas still apply here.
That is very helpful clarification. I appreciate that. And I certainly did not, I mean, this is one of the challenges of the whole initiative is how we root all of our work in the needs of people seeking help, even though so much of our work is abstracted at least 2 layers from it, in that we're building infrastructure and protocols that are used by the people who build the tools, that are used by the people who help the people in need. And we shouldn't lose sight of actually rooting this in those baseline prerogatives of what are the, what do the people in need. And so this does all, that's a helpful reminder, this does all flow downwards from our still live, evolving persona for the help seeker. But I think what Benj is raising, if I'll frame it as a question, is are there instances in which a help seeker's interests are directly, like, are there design decisions that we actually need to check by specifically help seekers for particular use cases within this API? Or one way or the other, are they all being filtered through the people who are actually going to be using the API to build tools, right?
Well, I would augment and add that this is a entirely new user group, a 5th one. It's the Uber top level, and at any point, how do we convert someone who's doing a specific implementation, a specific project, and provide feedback up the chain to our highest level, and how do we recruit them to eventually be on these calls and helping provide feedback and become a tool, take their tool from being just a single implementation to now being available as open source like Ohana and be used, or their knowledge or their expertise or just the schema or the OpenAPI. So.
Okay. Any other thoughts about this stuff? I think we brought up a bunch of things that are going to be open questions moving forward. We have about 5 minutes. I want to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about next steps, and also I have a little bit of an offer. And so, next steps from here, we've got. Tim has just put up version 1.1. Kin is going to be doing some work, applying 1.1 to his current sort of baseline API model. And Kin has also already started with iCarol's API. He'll be modeling with iCarol, and I think he's also in communication with at least one other vendor who have, they have their own API, and so he'll be, I think that's VisionLink. They're already in dialogue about modeling the existing API with this OpenAPI spec. And so we have space for a few more formal engagements where Kin will be partnered with an API implementer for at least a couple of rounds of sort of one-on-ones over the course of the next 6 months. That's also to note that Kin's services as an API specialist are available above and beyond that for anyone who actually wants to and has the resources to go deeper. So we'll be setting up those relationships. If you're an API implementer and you want to be actively involved in this process as opposed to just watching along and picking up what we do and running with it and maybe offering the odd comment here or there, if you want to be actively involved in shaping this and you have an API, you should reach out to us now, and we'll walk through the process of seeing, like, do you actually meet the criteria to be one of our semi-formal working group members? Can we identify a user in your community who we can talk to about some of the questions that come up along the way? So those are our next steps. I'll also say that we have a set of volunteers who have been recruited to us from one of our technical partners. Benetech has a great volunteer program called Code Alliance. We have a group of at least 2 to 4 volunteers who are willing to give cycles over the next month to 2 months to build reference implementations and tools. Our default with these volunteers is just to have them build an API implementation in a language of their choice. And we have someone who is a Google employee who's obviously familiar with the Google stack. Kin is going to, I think, be building PHP in the AWS platform, I think. We have a team from Microsoft who's talking to us about building an Azure implementation. And we have a volunteer who is going to build something in Node.js. And I would love to pair these folks up. If any of that rings a bell, if you have an implementation and a volunteer could help you build an open source implementation of this spec in one of those technology environments, please let me know, because I would love to see these volunteers actually paired with specific use cases rather than just building things in the cloud. So I'm going to put that out there, and just follow up with me after the call. And very briefly, I see Benj asks a question: what do you mean by end user in this case for group membership, help seekers? Yeah, so Benj's question is, when I say, we want an end user representing each one of the API implementers who's in our semi-formal work group, we're talking someone who is using either like the API to build an interface, or someone who's falls within one of our user groups that we've identified here. So in this case, it would be a programmer who's building an application to deliver this information, or a researcher who's trying to get this information to evaluate it and analyze it, or a database administrator who is experienced. Especially, I think the most important person we're looking for is someone who's actually experienced in working with this data. And if you are trying, essentially, we're looking for your user who you're building for as you're developing this API, or at least one or two of them. All right. And I should clarify, I have a limited set of stipends, about $3,000 that I can divvy up to actually stipend the time of a handful of user representatives. We're going to have at least 1 or 2 representatives of the AIRS Technology Committee. The AIRS community will be formal user stakeholder representatives. And I would like to actually, I'm sure the people who we're hoping to be involved are service providers, resource data specialists, people who probably have plenty of things on their plate, and we have a modest set of funds to be able to actually stipend their time to sit on calls like this, to test things, so that we're not just counting on volunteers working out of the goodness of their heart. So if we haven't already been talking to you about being an official working group member, identifying a specific end user from your community who can participate as one of our designated stakeholders, potentially with a stipend, if you're interested in that, please reach out to us after the call. And that brings us to 1:30. So I don't want to belabor this any longer. We covered a whole lot of ground. And if you have any follow-up questions, let me know in the chat or in the doc, or just send me an email or drop in on Slack. All right. How we feeling? Good?
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone. This was awesome.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.